Wow. I want to hear a lecture from that guy. Thank you, Lauren. And my heart is deeply moved by that. I really appreciate that, that generous introduction. And thank you all. Thank you all for being here. I spent a little bit of time, you probably saw me, sitting here just in the few minutes before we began, just kind of looking around and seeing all the faces and all the different ways I've encountered so many of you, and then some new faces that I haven't met, and sort of looking forward to further conversation, I hope, at some point. It has been my great joy over these several years to serve as chair of this Humanities department, and it's a great gift to, in this last year as chair, to have this opportunity to not be the one necessarily coordinating all the details and to be here to speak to you tonight. My title for my talk, Transformed by the Renewal of Your Minds, comes from St. Paul in his letter to the Romans, where in Romans 12 he says, "Be not conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewal of your minds." Most of you know, and you've just heard, if you didn't know before, that I'm a theologian, so maybe it's natural that I would pick a theme and a title that comes from Scripture. But I think this verse captures an insight that's somehow, broader than the way we usually think about the sort of narrow corridors of theology. I don't think you have to be a theologian or even necessarily to be a Christian to learn from it. And I guess I would say it's an insight that I've learned from theology, but I think it applies more broadly, applies to everything that we do as we think about, seeking wisdom. I came to the particular topic of my talk tonight by listening to my students. And in this, I'm following in the footsteps of my predecessors. This is the 10th year we've done this. And last year, Dr. Moreland was here. The year before that, Dr. Grubiak, my two immediate predecessors, really started from what am I hearing from my students? And what do they want to hear? What kinds of questions are they asking? So when I received this invitation, I said, well, I should follow in suit. What am I hearing from my students? What concerns do I get? And what I came to was that what I often hear, sitting across the desk from me there in the Humanities suite there in St. Augustine Center, I often hear students who are maybe even halfway through, but certainly by the time they're nearing the end of their education here at Villanova and their education in the Humanities department, the question they're asking is, what do I do next? I have been so happy here and so intellectually alive and so enthused by the kinds of learning that I've done here. What do I do when I get out there in the world? Am I going to find anybody who cares about this stuff in the way that I do? I actually had a student sitting in my office last spring who said, I know this is incredibly naive, but I just wish I could stay here. I just want to stay. I know that's naive. And I said, well, yeah, it is. Sorry, that is naive. I'm here to tell the truth tonight, right? I'm not going to lie to you. And this is the thing. College is this sort of privileged moment in time where you get to push back from some of the extrinsic concerns of life. Not all of them. They all come crashing in, right? But nonetheless, you get to push away from some of them to have this kind of privileged moment of reflection and of conviviality, friendship, inquiry, right? And it's not going to be the same. That's an uncomfortable truth for many of us. But I think that if you consider it well, if you really reflect on that, once you sort of come to accept that truth, that's a truth that will finally set you free. Why? Because it'll set you free from this desire to kind of preserve this chimerical construction of a perpetual life in college. Unless you're a professor, which you kind of get to do that. You get to stay in college forever. But if you don't do that, right, what are you going to do? Well, the one thing you shouldn't hope to do is kind of keep the same thing going. And once you accept that, then you can begin to focus on what you can keep, what you need to keep, what will stick, right? What will stick against the real world there. when you get to the serious business of your vocation, you'll only get to the serious business of your vocation if you let go this moment as if you could preserve it. Right? You'll only be able to do that. And I'm not going to talk about vocation tonight. You know, Dr. Moreland did that last year, and if you weren't here last year to see that amazing Faith and Reason lecture, tough to follow in the footsteps of that one, you can go to the Humanities webpage and you can find it, and it's still there, right? But what I am going to talk about is, I guess what I would say is the conditions around which or within which a vocation is found, right? What's the shape of a life that allows one's vocation to emerge? Does that make sense? Yeah? What are the conditions? What's the sort of context, the background, the habits and the practices that we all need to have in order for this question of what I'm being called into to really emerge and to flourish? What does it take to hear those words of Paul, right? To be renewed, right? Be transformed by the renewal of your mind. What does that take? What's it look like? Now, one piece of that may be obvious, right? One piece of that may be obvious. You need to find people that you can hang out with. And you may have, if you're following us on Facebook, you've seen that we have these Humanities for Good. You get it? For good. For, yeah, good. We have these groups of alums from all different years, right? From a widespread of years who get together once a month, once a season, I don't know. They get together, they talk about something interesting, they share their kind of fellowship. And what's been amazing to see is the way in which people who graduated 6, 7, they didn't know each other at all. They come together around a table like this, and they have the kinds of conversations that they've missed. That's part of the story. That's part of the answer, right? But is it the whole answer? It can't be all of it. Because we're not always going to be able to find that community, that circle of friends. What else can we do? If you want to hold on to your humanities education, if you want to put into practice the liberal education that you're receiving here at Villanova, let me suggest it has to start by a change in the way we think about our education itself. We need to change the way we approach what it is that we're encountering, what it is that we're going through here and now. Because that'll allow us to hold on to what we can hold on to later. What am I saying? Good question. If we are succeeding in what we want to do here at Villanova and in Humanities, I hope we're succeeding because we help remind people of the possibilities of a liberal education. And at that point, you may be sitting there in your seat going, oh, crap. Listen to that. Here we go. The possibilities of a liberal education, another sort of platitude, right, about liberal education. We've heard enough. But I mean something more than that. I don't mean just sort of critical thinking and all these things that we say. Well, those are all skills. No, what I mean is to think of our education as the opening of a horizon. Not as the acquisition of skills. Well, it's good to acquire skills. That's good. But it's more than that. It's not the execution of an exquisite resume. That's good too. But it's more than that. We, in humanities, we like to use terms like wonder. We like to use terms like epiphanies to describe what it is that we're talking about. And what those terms are trying to get at, I think, is an account of the deep structure of things, a change that goes all the way down, a complete kind of cognitive shift into a different way of seeing reality. What's that like? I think we're not used to thinking of our education in those terms, which is why we defer to thinking about it in terms of skills. Critical thinking, and you learn how to write, you learn how to think. All that's all true. But what's the deep structure of that? We're not used to thinking of it that way. And so to get at that, I want to borrow a little bit once again. Since I already borrowed from St. Paul, I'll keep going with my theological move here. And I think we can borrow a notion from the tradition of, or from the religious tradition, from the theological tradition, as a way of getting at what it is that I'm talking about. Not necessarily in a religious way, but just as a term that allows us to engage things in a wider horizon. So, when Jesus of Nazareth shows up, the Gospel of Mark tells us the first thing he says, the first words out of his mouth are, the kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe the good news. That's the first thing he says. Right? Now, the word that we have there, repent, we usually cast in moral terms. Don't be bad anymore, be good. Right? Stop doing the bad stuff that you did and turn around and do good stuff. But the term itself, the Greek term is metanoete, right? Metanoete. And the term really is better, more literally translated as a change of your mind, a change of your ideas, a change of your mindset, a change in your whole way of seeing. So in that sense, what Jesus is saying is stop. He's saying more than stop being bad. He's saying look at things in a wholly different way. And what I'm saying to you here is that without necessarily preaching the gospel in the way that Jesus does here, the opportunity that you have here in your education is to see things in a fundamentally different way. Not just to acquire knowledge, not just to read great stuff, but to see things differently. That can seem like a tall order. Because when we try to think up what makes up our way of seeing, it's so much wider and so much more comprehensive than the way we usually talk about our education. Because we're talking about faith, we're talking about reason, we're talking about affection, we're talking about imagination, habit, practice. All those things all add up to the way we think and the way we see. And so our education has to soak into all those levels if we're going to be transformed by the renewal of our minds. My friend Tom Smith, my predecessor as chair here, and the founder of this great department, he's often said that, about this same verse in the gospel where Jesus says, the kingdom of God is at hand. We typically have read that as sort of like, here it comes, it's, the world's about to end. And he said, well, what if we thought of it as at hand, as sort of like, it's right here, right? It's at hand, right? You said, what am I going to do? I can't see. Like, well, the solution is at hand. Oh, now I can see, right? So if it's right there, what if the shift in perspective is available to you here, now? Right? Not something new, but something that's present. And what you have to do is change your perspective. That's the wager. What if you could begin to see the world in a different way? What if you could engage with the issues of your life here and now and the issues in your life in the future? What if you could engage them without some of that sort of crushing fear and anxiety that we all seem to undergo? I just saw today the headline in the publication Inside Higher Ed. It was an opinion column from a professor who said, I've come to see. The headline was, today's students are not coddled, they're defeated. Oh, that's so depressing. But the point is, if there's a ritual complaint that, today's students, you guys have had everything handed to you, you haven't really had to stuff, or, you may have heard a version of that somewhere, right? This professor was saying, no, my experience is that the students I run into are feeling defeated. They're feeling like they've been running down this narrow channel since they were 6. Right? They've been running on this treadmill since they were 6, and they're tired. They're drained. They don't know what the options are. A recent survey conducted by the University of California suggests that more than 10% of college students now are struggling with some degree of frequent depression. And that's up from 6% in the same survey in 2009 and 4% in 2000. Whew, that's a brief window there. We're feeling the pressure. 35% of you, according to the same study, are feeling overwhelmed by your life. And that's up from 25% in 2009, 19% in 2000. Countless students, I can't tell you how many, have sat in my office over the last 8 years or 7 years and told me how they felt like they've been on a treadmill from the very beginning. And for some of these students, the experience of being in a great class, a humanities class, some other class, can be like a great class in liberal education, can be this sort of blessed relief, like this escape, right? If you're in Catholic novel, or if you're in forgiveness, or if you're in development of capitalism, right? All these, the literature and politics. If you're in any of these classes that we have here, you say, oh, finally a place where I can breathe, right? I can just play a little while with great books and great ideas and great friends. And that's great. But if that's the limit of what a great elective course is for you, you're leaving a lot on the table, I think. Right? There's still more to it. Why do we leave that much on the table? Well, what I want to suggest to you is that we suffer from a sort of, a constrained or a limited imagination. We just can't imagine that the world could be otherwise. All the colors seem just a little dimmer. And that's not a new problem, that's an old problem. In the 19th century, John Henry Newman, the great cardinal and theologian and philosopher and teacher, was writing to a friend of his, and he was talking about the relationship between science and religion, and how a lot of the people that he was talking to just didn't sort of see the need or the have the desire for a religious perspective on things. And what he said at that time was, I'm convinced that it is not reason that is against us, but imagination. Right? That the world just doesn't seem to allow for this wider horizon that a religious point of view can offer. It just doesn't seem real. It just doesn't seem possible. I'm convinced that that's what Gerard Manley Hopkins is all about in his great poem, God's Grandeur, which many of you have run into in your humanities classes. And I just couldn't resist. We need to hear it.
God's grandeur. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil, crushed. Why do men then now not wreck his road? Generations have trod, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, and wears man's smudge, and shares man's smell. The soil is bare now, nor can foot feel, being shod. And for all this, nature is never spent. There lives the dearest freshness deep down things. And though the last lights of the black west went, oh, morning at the brown brink eastwards springs, because the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods, with warm breast and with bright wings.
Love it. So what is going on in that poem? Why does that poem still resonate with us so powerfully as it does with so many of the humanities students that I encounter, right? They talk about this. Why? Because it's this sort of invitation into a wider horizon of imagining, with the frank acknowledgement, the sort of contrast that's introduced within the poem of, of a world that sort of just can't even see how amazing the world around it is. A society that can't even see because it's so sort of wrapped up in its own activity, its own work, its own industry. All of these things have obscured the reality. And yet the reality is right there. It's ready to hand, right? It's at hand. If we could only open up to see it. Right? So Newman is talking about diminished imagination. Hopkins talking about diminished imagination. That's, 150 years ago. They're worried about that. This is not a new problem, and yet I feel it with a sort of renewed intensity from the students who sit in my office from day to day and from year to year. Right? So what can we do about it? Part of the solution is to see the ways in which, when we hear this word imagination, we often think that what we mean is a sort of escape, a sort of fantasy. And I don't have time to sort of really develop this, and we can talk about it more after the talk and all that. But what I want to suggest to you is that imagination is not a way of escaping reality. It's precisely a way of engaging reality. That in a sense, the constrained imagination, that this is all that the world has to offer, this sort of paucity of goods, this sort of paucity of possibility, if that constrained imagination is as much a work of imagination as what Hopkins is portraying there. We engage the world through our imagining. And so if we can challenge and expand our imagining, we can see things differently. And everything can change. So I want to tell a story, and it's a story that some people have heard. Of course, how could I give this lecture and not have Dante show up? I want to tell a story about Dante Alighieri, 14th century poet. Dante, as a young man, was a brilliant young guy, brilliant poet, talented fellow, had a great group of friends who were part of a sort of whole emerging artistic movement. When he sort of took leave of that for a while and got involved in politics, he was immediately a success there. He became a senator, well, the equivalent of like a senator, and then a consul, and then back after he did his term as a consul, he went back to being a senator. His life was working out just perfect. Everything he touched seemed to turn to gold. And then while he was out of town doing his senatorial work, the balance of power at home shifted, and Dante found himself, as still a relatively young man, exiled from his own city. His life fell apart. Everything that he had worked toward, everything that he had sort of envisioned for his life was gone. He was under sentence of death. If he ever came back to Florence, they would burn him in the city square. So he found himself, after all of that success, he found himself alone, dependent on the hospitality of strangers. What would I do if I were that poet? If I were a poet and my life had fallen apart? I hope I wouldn't, but I think I would probably write pity poems. Well, and hopefully I'd be really good at it and make people feel really sorry for me. Right? I would write really sad poems about how life has turned against me. Right? Dante's impulse seems to be exactly the opposite. Instead of writing a poem that's sort of closed in on me and my problems, instead what you get is this poem that's about simply everything. It's about the entire cosmos. Why do you write a poem about everything when your life falls apart? Why do you do that? What I want to suggest is that what Dante was able to do in and through that was that he's able to sort of write himself out of the narrowness of an impoverished imagination. He was able to write himself out into a wider horizon that didn't take his problems away. He was still angry. He was still hurt. He was still frustrated. He still had a lot of things to say about what was going wrong with the world around him. But he could see that whole thing in a different horizon. Right? He could see that the world really, for all its failures, for all its collapses, for all its disappointments, the world really only made sense in relation to the love that moves the sun and other stars. And through that, he could see the world differently. And I think the poem still speaks to us in this powerful way, even after we've left the sort of Ptolemaic universe that it describes behind, right? All the physics and everything, we kind of look at and say, well, I guess, that's what he did in the 14th century. But we still read this poem. We still sort of say, wow, there's something really powerful there. Why? Because we encounter the world in a new and different way in and through the reading of it. Now, one last example. This is the graphic that you've probably seen walking in if you didn't see it before. This is a rose window in the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis in Paris. And some people have seen, I've actually taught this window before. I love teaching windows. So what is it about this picture here? Well, I want to focus in on this guy here. Now, it's a little pixelated, but I hope you can kind of make sense of it. What do we have here? This is a baker, right? Here's a guy, he's in his little baker's smock, and he's got a little, like a pizza peel, right? Here's the brick oven here where he's putting the bread in. He's doing his work. He's just doing his work. He's putting the bread in the oven, taking it out. Putting the bread in the oven and taking it out. And there's a way in which that work could feel consuming and stultifying, right? So just feel like it constrains every waking moment you have is about bread. Right? Time to make the bread. Time to, right? If you ever spend a lot of time making bread, it takes a lot of time. And if that were your job, you could see how it could be kind of consuming. You could see the ways in which you could think that your world was constrained to this little tiny window that we have here. Right? When in fact, it's actually part of this whole wider perspective. So let's take a look at this. I hope you can kind of see this, because I just think this is amazing. Because what do we have here? I mean, there's our baker there. Here we have a shepherd, right? Here we have, let's see, what are some of the other ones that you can easily see? Here's a guy plowing. Here's a guy laying seed down, right? He's sowing seed, right? You have people doing their daily work on the outer edge of this circle. And if you were to focus on that, you'd have each individual little piece there, kind of separated from each other, kind of consumed in its own little world there. But when you look at the whole, what do you see? Anybody know what we see here, what these are? Here, right? What we see around this circle? You recognize them? Zodiac. This is the sign of the zodiac. There's Scorpio, there's Libra, right? There's Leo. Right? These are the signs of the zodiac. So this is the workaday life, right? This is the path of a year, right? This is the sort of the path of a year that goes round and round. And then what do we have in here? This might be harder to see. Let me see if I can zoom in a little bit for you guys. I think this is the easiest one to see. Again, pixelated, sorry about that. But what we have is 6 scenes with this figure here, and I'll cut to the chase. That's Jesus. Okay? Interspersed with angels who are just praying, right? Basically taking up the space because you only have you have 6 things to say and you've got 12 spots. Right? So you've got 6 things, so let's think. 6 things. We have the sun and the moon. So what's going on in this middle circle in this window? 6, sun and moon. This is creation. These are the 6 days of creation from Genesis, right? So this window is establishing a relationship between my workaday life, the path of the cyclical pattern of a whole year, and the story that goes back to the very beginning, right? Of the way in which all creation is given into being through God's creative act. And all of that centers on the love of the Father there, who's got the whole world in his hand. Right? So this window is sort of performing, in a sense, sort of displaying for us the ways in which the particular ins and outs of our life can fit into this much wider horizon, that the whole is so much bigger than all these particular parts. So the question is, can we sort of leverage that out? Right? Can we leverage our imagination? Can we sort of exert some pressure to sort of expand our imagination in that way? Right? Where does that leave us? And I'm turning towards the end, I promise. What I'm suggesting to you is that the course of study that you've undertaken in Humanities or here at Villanova, from Gateway courses to the Senior Symposium if you're a Humanities major, along with many, many other courses and opportunities you've had here at Villanova, they've presented you and will continue to present you with moments of epiphany, with moments of wonder. And that we can all make good use of these moments if we can just let them take root. Let them renew our minds and transform us. But how do we do that? What do we do when we have a moment of wonder, when we have an epiphany? If we treat it like a singular phenomenon, an event or a moment in our lives, just that, we might develop a kind of wonder addiction, right? We might develop a kind of desire to move from peak experience to peak experience, or whatever we want to call it, right? This sort of desire to move from one great experience that you receive to the next. Can't wait to go to class to see what Dr. Tomko is going to, how he's going to blow my mind today, right? Happens to me all the time. Right? Well, I mean, and that's great. That's fantastic. But that would still place us in this position of considering our education as a kind of passive receiving, right? A kind of waiting for the next great moment to come. That's what I mean by a kind of wonder addiction that way. And there's nothing wrong with having great experience in class like that. That's not the problem. The only problem is if we leave it there, if we leave ourselves as the sort of passive recipients of our education in that way, then it's really easy to see how when we leave Villanova, when we go into our workaday lives, it will evaporate, it'll disappear. What's the alternative? Well, if we think about our education not as a sort of series of events, or as a sort of series of acquisition of a set of skills, right? If we think about it differently from that, if we think about it as a metanoia, right, as this sort of fundamental change in our way of seeing, then we might respond in a different way. We can see that an epiphany is the springing to life of the seed of wonder. And as such, it has to be fed, has to be planted, has to be fed, has to be nourished, has to be cultivated. We need, in a sense, to be gardeners, farmers of the seeds of wonder. We need to cultivate them. Good habits of viticulture, right? So that we nourish these vines along that spring up from these seeds. So that what was born in an epiphany can begin to yield fruit in knowledge and maybe even the wine of wisdom in the long haul. One of the things I do is I study theology and spirituality, which I don't even know what that is exactly, but that's what people tell me I study. And what I think it means is that what I care about is where the sort of doctrine and the ideas that I have sort of meet people in their real life, so how it overflows in practice. And one of the things that I've learned is, reading the Desert Fathers or reading the monastic tradition, is that these are whole sort of cultures that are devoted to integrating insights into the shape of a life. And that's what I'm suggesting we might begin to think about. That we might begin to think about what sort of habits and practices, what sort of spiritual exercises you might even call them. I don't know, intellectual exercises, call it what you want, right? We might sort of incorporate into our lives that would allow us to hold on to this stuff. Could we think about our life, our education here at Villanova, as a kind of craft of living? Right? What would those habits look like? I don't have a full answer to that. All I can do is kind of make some suggestions, and I don't want to keep you here forever tonight. So I'll only sort of sketch a few of those that I think are crucial to this. The first is silence. And I think this is particularly, one of the reasons I list this first is because I think this is one of the most threatened commodities, it's not even that, one of these most threatened dimensions of our life that we encounter right now. Silence. Not just the absence of sound waves, although that's pretty crucial. I'm in favor, right? But a kind of practiced repose. A kind of unplugging from all our devices and all that stuff, right? Practiced repose without phones or earbuds, without YouTubes, without Vines. I think one of the reasons why we're prone to the kind of wonder addiction I talked about is precisely because we're sort of, our capacity for sustained quiet, sustained attention is being diminished because we're constantly stimulated, right? We're constantly provoked. We're constantly sort of encountering something right before our eyes. And, you know, I don't want this to be the kind of ritual complaint about how we're too plugged in. That's all true, I think. But, you know, what I'm saying is something more than that. I want to suggest to you that the constant noise, the constant stimulation could feel like an expansion of the imagination in the way that I've been talking about, but it's actually a constraint. It could feel like an expansion because look what they can do with CGI. Look, I can watch it right here. Right? Look at the way all the amazing things we're able to show on screen. And yet, it's a constraining, right? It's a diminishing of our capacity to encounter reality in our imagination. The net effect of all of that noise is to keep you focused on the small stuff, keep you focused on your pizza peel and your bread oven, on the tasks and the skills and the events, so that you don't know how anymore to push back from it and ponder and wonder and let all things soak in. So I think this kind of silence, practiced every day, is one of the most crucial and important habits that we need to develop as a kind of resistance strategy, you know, kind of way of pushing back. And I like these two quotes from Abraham Joshua Heschel because he talks about the sort of need for that time set aside. There's a realm of time where the goal is not to have, but to be, not to own, but to give, not to control, but to share, not to subdue, but be in accord. Life goes wrong when the control of space, the acquisition of things of space become our sole concern. We manipulate what is available on the surface of the world. We must also stand in awe before the mystery of the world. Right? Do we have space in our life to do it? That requires, what I'm saying to you is that requires practice. You can't just wait around for awe and the mystery of the world to happen. I mean, it will happen, but not often enough. You need to create the space for it. Second habit, living with the natural world. It's related to the first. We need to self-consciously renew our relationship to the natural world around us. You need to spend time. You need to take a look. Some of you have had the experience with Dr. Schiffman's class, right, of being assigned this sort of, just go and sit in this one spot every week and talk about it. And, you know, I used to love to watch the expression on people's faces when he would sort of explain this. They'd be kind of like, okay. And then you would see, because I've done it too, truth and purpose, what you'd see is the first couple of reflections that people would say is, I don't know what to do. I'm sitting here, writing, still sitting. It's cold. That's what you would get, right? And then by the end, you're saying, I feel the air move, you know, right? And you're like, what the heck happened to these people, right? But it's what happens when you set this time aside and you experience the natural world in this way. This great quote from Thomas Merton, right? Where he goes out in the woods, he's living as a hermit, he's living in this little shack, and he's writing about being in a rainstorm. And he said, the rain I am in is not like the rain of cities. It fills the wood with an immense and confused sound. It covers the flat roof of the cabin and its porch with insistent and controlled rhythms. And I listen because it reminds me again and again that the whole world runs by rhythms I have not yet learned to recognize. Rhythms that are not those of the engineer. Sorry, anybody's an engineer in here? But, right? To be encountering the natural world in this way is to remember that the world has a rhythm that is larger than the one I can establish, the one I can make. Reading. Think, really? Reading? Yeah. You would be shocked, maybe you'll be shocked, to realize how hard it is to keep up a life of reading for the joy of reading, once you don't have to read anymore. Right? Once you're not required to read anymore. Part of that is because, you know, and I'll take responsibility on behalf of my profession. We beat it out of you, poor souls, right? We beat out the love of reading from you sometimes. I'm sorry that we do that, but we do. I see it happen to my kids already, and they're in grade school and high school, right? But partly it's because we haven't learned to read in a different way. We haven't learned to sort of introduce into our life a habit of reading that's not just about what's required. I just really, because I didn't have anything better to do, not through any virtue of my own, but when I was in college here at Villanova, I started this practice that I really have enjoyed in various permutations since. During exam week, I would read a novel, right? And my thought was, well, why? Why was I not studying in those moments? Well, the thing was, my mind was cooking because I was prepping for exams, right? My mind was so I couldn't just sit still and do nothing. So I would pick up something that had nothing to do with anything else, and I would read. And I found it to be refreshing, renewing. And it established in me this recognition, I guess, that just reading what I was assigned to read would never be enough. Right? So here's this great little quote from Sir Tiange, Intellectual Life. Some people have read that before. Don't read anything that excites you too much. Right? But think about what you're reading. Writing. And I'm going to go quickly here because I want to keep time. I want to wrap up. But writing gives roots to understanding and helps it grow. Dr. Vince Fitzpatrick. Who's Dr. Vince Fitzpatrick, you may ask? Well, good question. He was my sophomore high school writing instructor. I love that guy. And this is why he said this to me, writing gives roots to understanding. Like you don't really really ground something that you've learned unless you write about it. And then it can grow, and then it can actually flourish. I always thank Dr. Fitzpatrick for that, because he told me that a long time ago. It stayed with me this whole time. Working. Say, well, of course we're working. No, I mean actually working with your hands, doing something. Go garden. Do some carpentry. I don't know. Whatever it is. Right? Chop wood. Take care of your house. Build a bike. I don't know what it is, but there's a way in which what we need is a way to remember that we are this embodied creature that is a maker as well as a thinker. And we will think better if we're also making. And I'm not going to read it just because of the time, but there's this great quote, right? The satisfaction, okay, I am going to read it. The satisfaction manifesting itself concretely in the world through manual competence has been known to make a man quiet, and a woman, quiet and easy. They seem to relieve him of the felt need to offer chattering interpretations of himself to vindicate his worth. He can simply point. Look what I did. Right? That's a crucial skill, a habit that we need. The last one, I think, is one that is near and dear to humanities here. And this is the only, not ing word here, but I made an exception. Right? Conviviality. We need to find the support of like-minded people. And sometimes that's going to be hard. Like I said, we have Humanities for Good. We have these great opportunities that we're trying to establish here. The reason that we're doing that is because there's this felt need out there to find that community of people. But you need to find a community of people. We can't do this kind of work simply on our own. It's why, again, I sort of study monks and stuff, right? It's why monks live in community. Even if they're solitaries, they need the support of a community. Right? And so will you, so will I. So I'm sure there are more, and maybe there are things you want to ask me about or things I haven't said here. But just a few words in closing then. This is our annual Faith and Reason lecture. And what I hope I've done tonight is to suggest some of the ways faith and reason are not just concepts to be integrated at an intellectual level, but habits of mind and heart that go right to the root of things, that open up a whole different way of seeing reality. And that opening up is not a once and for all event, but something that is cultivated, something that is nurtured, something that is supported and strengthened by a whole program that we might call the craft of living. I don't have all the answers to how best to develop that craft of living, but I'm convinced the only way to hold on to our humanities education, to hold on to our liberal education when we leave these sheltered walls, right, over the course of a lifetime is by doing something like this, by developing new habits. Because it's especially true because the world that surrounds us would seem to encourage habits in the opposite direction. So it's only when we can lean into our education as a practice, as a craft, that we can hope to follow St. Paul's advice, to be not conformed to the world, but to be transformed by the renewal of our minds. Thank you all.